Magic Johnson built his name in basketball, then quietly used that name to buy ownership stakes in businesses and sports teams worth billions of dollars. Today, the Lakers legend owns a fortune Forbes estimates at about $1.6 billion, along with interests in 5 professional sports teams. But how did Magic Johnson turn an NBA career into a $1.6 billion empire? The Los Angeles Dodgers is not a small investment. It is one of the most famous franchises in Major League Baseball. The Washington Commanders is even larger in deal size. In 2023, an investment group that included Magic bought this NFL team for $6.05 billion. And those are just the 2 most recognizable names. Magic currently holds interests in 5 teams across different ecosystems of American sports. When talking about a former NBA player, this is not simply buying a few investments after retirement. This is the step from someone who once played for a franchise to someone who owns real pieces of multiple franchises. But this is the part that makes the story special. Magic did not make $1.6 billion by playing basketball. Over his entire NBA career, he earned only about $40 million in salary. Do the math. Magic's current fortune is roughly 40 times the total salary the Lakers ever paid him. And his most important asset is not even the Dodgers, the Commanders, or any sports team. It is also not Starbucks, the deal that many Americans still think of first when they mention Magic Johnson the businessman. Behind those famous names is a massive financial enterprise, less glamorous than a stadium full of fans, but far more important to his fortune. That is the part that makes the story hold up. This is not a superstar earning hundreds of millions in salary and simply taking the money to invest. Magic entered the NBA in 1979, when sports contracts still belonged to a completely different world, then spent decades building wealth in movie theaters, restaurants, real estate, healthcare, insurance, infrastructure, technology, and professional sports. He built businesses, sold some of them, then moved capital into larger assets. And in the end, the investments that received less public attention became more important than the deals that appeared on the sports pages. So how did a kid from Lansing, Michigan end up with $1.6 billion and interests in 5 professional sports teams? The answer begins with a deal Magic once passed on, when he was still too young to understand the thing that would later shape nearly his entire empire: equity, ownership. The answer begins in Lansing, Michigan, where Magic Johnson grew up in a working-class family where money did not come from stocks, private equity, or meetings on Wall Street. His father, Irvin Johnson Sr., worked for General Motors and took on extra jobs to support the family. His mother also worked. For young Magic, the way a person built a life was fairly simple: work, collect a paycheck, save, and keep working. Nothing in that childhood prepared him to understand how truly wealthy people use equity to keep wealth growing even when they are no longer working directly. Basketball was the first thing that changed Magic's life. From Michigan State, he entered the NBA in 1979 and almost immediately became one of the biggest faces of the Los Angeles Lakers. But he entered the league with far more knowledge about basketball than about ownership. That showed clearly in a decision Magic would remember for decades afterward. When he was still a young star preparing to enter the NBA, he was approached by Nike, which at the time was still a much smaller company than the global empire it is today. An offer structure that included stock was put on the table, while Converse, the brand already tied to the big NBA stars, offered something Magic understood better: guaranteed money. Magic chose the money, not because he thought Nike would fail. He simply did not yet understand what stock could become. He grew up in a family where a dollar meant a dollar earned from work, so a promise of equity in a young company could hardly compete with an actual check. There is no need to imagine how many billions Magic lost by not keeping Nike stock, because no one knows how long he would have held it or when he would have sold it. What matters is the lesson. Salary pays for your time, endorsements pay for your name, but ownership lets you benefit from the value a business continues to create afterward. Magic would earn about $40 million in salary over his entire NBA career, a very large fortune in his era, but smaller than the money a modern superstar can receive from just one long-term contract. And then in 1991, at age 32, the career he thought still had time ahead suddenly changed when he announced he was HIV positive and left the NBA. Basketball had given Magic money, fame, and a name that all of America recognized, but it also gave him another lesson: a playing career always has an end date. Magic could not go back to 1979 to choose Nike stock. He could only do something else: spend the rest of his life seeking ownership in places where most of corporate America at the time still did not see value. And it was precisely the search for ownership in places others had not yet seen value that brought Magic Johnson to the first foundation of his business empire. In 1990, he founded Magic Johnson Enterprises, but the company's greatest advantage was not only the Magic Johnson name. He saw a market that many corporate America boardrooms at the time still undervalued: Black, Latino, and multicultural communities in America's major cities. Many corporations looked at these areas and saw risk. Magic saw millions of people who still went to the movies, drank coffee, ate out, and spent money on brands they trusted. The problem was not that those communities lacked purchasing power. The problem was that many businesses had not truly served them. One of the first major experiments was Magic Johnson Theaters. In 1996, Johnson Development Corporation partnered with Sony Retail Entertainment to bring modern multiplexes into urban communities that the big chains often overlooked. Magic did not want to offer a cheaper version. He wanted to prove that if you brought a quality product to the right place, customers would show up. The system eventually grew to 6 theaters, with 72 screens in markets such as Los Angeles, Atlanta, Houston, Cleveland, and Harlem. That was not just a movie theater business. It proved Magic's thesis could make money. Then Starbucks arrived. In 1998, Johnson Development and Starbucks formed Urban Coffee Opportunities, taking the brand deeper into urban markets it had not yet heavily penetrated. The partnership eventually grew to more than 100 locations. But Starbucks was not the deal that alone turned Magic into a billionaire. The greater value lay in what it proved. Magic could turn understanding of culture and consumer behavior into business results, and he kept repeating that formula. Pepsi distribution, TGI Fridays, Fatburger, Burger King, and 24-Hour Fitness appeared one after another in the portfolio. Different brands, but nearly the same strategy: find a strong company, find an underserved market, then prove that the opportunity there was larger than what corporate America imagined. By this point, Magic was no longer just an athlete collecting endorsement checks. He was building partnerships, opening markets, and owning pieces of the businesses he helped grow. The theaters, Starbucks, and restaurants made him money. But more importantly, they made the business world begin to regard Irvin Johnson as a real businessman rather than only Magic Johnson, the basketball celebrity. Still, he was not yet a billionaire. To go from millionaire to a $1.6 billion fortune, Magic still had to learn another skill: not only knowing how to buy the right assets, but also knowing when to sell a successful asset, take the capital out, and put it into something larger. That is when Magic Johnson began to change the way he thought about money. He no longer looked at a successful business as something that had to be held forever just because it was generating profits or was tied to an important part of his life. Sometimes, the greatest value of an asset does not lie in continuing to own it, but in the amount of capital it can free up for the next step. In 2010, Magic sold his ownership stake in the Los Angeles Lakers, the team that had turned him into an American icon. Around the same time, he also exited his interest in the Starbucks partnership. To many people, that might have looked like walking away from two of the most recognizable assets in his entire business career. But Magic was not retreating from ownership. He was upgrading it. 2 years later, that capital helped him step into a deal of an entirely different scale. In 2012, Magic joined the investment group that bought the Los Angeles Dodgers, one of the most famous franchises in Major League Baseball, and Forbes later estimated his initial investment at around $50 million. This was no longer about opening a store, a theater, or a restaurant franchise. This was about entering the ownership group of a multi-billion-dollar sports asset, where value comes not only from tickets sold, but also from broadcast rights, sponsorships, real estate, brand equity, and the long-term appreciation of the franchise itself. And that is when Magic truly began to look more like a capital allocator than an operator. But the Dodgers were only the easy-to-see part. In the years before that, Magic had worked with partners to build the Canyon Johnson Urban Funds, putting capital into institutional real estate, urban redevelopment, and projects far more complex than the retail model the public was familiar with. This was an important shift. Instead of only helping a brand sell more products in a specific neighborhood, Magic began participating in vehicles that could influence entire urban areas, commercial real estate, and large-scale development projects. At the same time, Sodexo Magic showed that his empire was moving into yet another layer. No longer just consumer-facing businesses tied directly to the Magic Johnson name, this was B2B and institutional services, less glamorous than Starbucks, but better suited to a businessman looking for large, stable, scalable revenue streams. That was the increasingly clear pattern in how Magic invested. Build an asset, prove it works, then if the timing is right, move that value into a larger asset. The Lakers and Starbucks were not chapters he left behind. They were the steps that helped him reach the Dodgers, real estate and institutional business. But even the Dodgers was not yet the most important deal on the path to becoming a billionaire. Around the same time Magic entered baseball ownership, he also put money into a healthcare company in Florida that most Lakers fans had never heard of. No stadium, no famous logo, and almost no sports headlines. But that quiet investment would produce a return that changed the entire scale of Magic's fortune. And that little-known healthcare company was Simply Healthcare. While the Dodgers deal put Magic Johnson's name all over the sports pages, Simply Healthcare generated almost none of the same attention. No stadium, no grandstands, no logo worn by millions of people on their shirts. This was a managed healthcare company in Florida, serving Medicaid populations and patient groups with specialized care needs. But it was precisely in a business as unglamorous as this that Magic again saw what he had learned to look for over many years: a market with large demand, a business with the ability to scale, and an opportunity for ownership to create more value than an endorsement check or a famous franchise. Magic Johnson Enterprises did not just put money in and stand on the sidelines waiting for results. According to MJE itself, the company participated in marketing, regulatory matters, and board involvement, meaning this was not a passive investment, and the numbers began to change very quickly. According to MJE, Simply Healthcare's membership grew from about 30,000 to 270,000 members in less than 3 years. Do the math. That is a multi-fold increase in a very short period, and it shows Magic was not merely betting on a small company. He was betting on a healthcare platform capable of scaling at a speed the market ultimately could not ignore. By 2015, Simply Healthcare was sold in a deal worth about $1 billion. And according to Magic Johnson Enterprises, their investment produced a return of about 16 times the original capital. There is no need to guess how much Magic personally pocketed from that transaction, because the exact figure has not been made public. What matters more is what this deal did to the overall scale of his capital. This was not profit from a Starbucks store or a small real estate appreciation. This was the kind of liquidity that could open the door to an entirely different class of assets. The Dodgers had shown that Magic knew how to use capital from older assets to step into a larger franchise. Simply Healthcare proved that was not a one-time stroke of luck. He had begun to understand how to find a little-noticed business, help it grow, then turn equity into capital for the next move. And that next move would be larger than anything he had done before. Up to this point, if Americans thought of Magic Johnson the businessman, they might still think of Starbucks, movie theaters, or the Dodgers. But the Simply deal brought him to an entirely different name: Equitrust Life Insurance. This is not a business with the appeal of sports or retail. It does not generate headlines every weekend, but it is precisely that less glamorous place that would become the real turning point in Magic Johnson's fortune, and ultimately, the most important asset on the path that put him into the ranks of billionaires. And that is when Equitrust completely changed the scale of Magic Johnson's wealth. In 2015, Magic Johnson Enterprises bought controlling interest of about 60% of Equitrust Life Insurance Company. This was no longer a partnership like Starbucks, a minority stake, or a deal based mainly on the power of the Magic Johnson brand. This time, he became the majority owner of a real financial services company. When Magic stepped in, Equitrust had about $16 billion in assets. Today, Forbes reports that figure has grown to about $33 billion. And this needs to be made clear. $33 billion is not Magic's personal wealth. That is the assets of Equitrust and the company's financial operations. Magic's personal fortune is estimated by Forbes at about $1.6 billion, but the ownership stake in Equitrust is regarded as the largest component of that fortune. That is what makes this deal different. Equitrust deals in life insurance and annuity products. There are no crowded stores like Starbucks, no stadium, championship parade, or millions of people wearing a logo like a sports franchise. But behind that less glamorous exterior is a business that can operate at a scale of tens of billions of dollars and continue creating economic value without Magic needing to appear in front of the cameras. Look back at the path he has taken. Magic Johnson Theaters proved he understood the urban consumers that corporate America once undervalued. Starbucks proved that understanding could produce commercial results. The Dodgers put him into ownership of a top-tier sports franchise. Simply Healthcare produced a return of about 16 times MJE's invested capital. But Equitrust took Magic to an entirely different level: control. He was no longer merely owning a small piece of someone else's business. He owned the majority of the company. And when Equitrust grew its assets from about $16 billion to about $33 billion, that stake became the most important foundation on the path that put Magic into the ranks of billionaires. That is also the part many fans have never seen when they think about Magic Johnson. Basketball created the name. Starbucks made America see him as a businessman. But an insurance company that rarely appears on the sports pages became the most important part of his fortune. Magic was once paid to play for a franchise. Now he has learned a larger lesson. Real wealth does not necessarily lie where the brightest lights are. It can lie in businesses that continue to increase in value long after the owner has left the court. And when Equitrust put Magic Johnson into the asset tier of billionaires, sports ownership once again became the most visible part of that empire. The Dodgers was the first franchise that opened the door, but it was not the stopping point. From there, Magic successively stepped into ownership of the Los Angeles Dodgers, the Los Angeles Sparks, LAFC, the Washington Commanders, and the Washington Spirit, 5 professional sports teams spanning baseball, basketball, and football to men's and women's soccer. With the Los Angeles Sparks, the story carried more meaning than just an investment. Magic returned to basketball, but this time not as a player. He walked into the room as an owner. And during the ownership period in which he participated, the Sparks won the WNBA championship in 2016, turning a part of Magic's past into an entirely new chapter. The person who was once paid to compete now held an interest in a basketball franchise itself. Next came LAFC, taking Magic into Major League Soccer and placing him in an American sports market that was growing rapidly in attendance, sponsorship, broadcast value, and cultural appeal. But the biggest leap in scale came with the Washington Commanders. In 2023, Magic joined the investor group that bought this NFL franchise for more than $6 billion. Place that figure next to the early days when he was still developing theaters, restaurants, or Starbucks. A person who once built an empire one retail location at a time had now stepped into ownership of an NFL asset, the largest commercial sports league in America. And the portfolio still did not stop. In 2024, Magic joined the investor group of the Washington Spirit, expanding further into the NWSL and women's soccer, a sector that is growing strongly in both investment and commercial value. Beyond those 5 professional teams, Magic also has exposure to esports through Team Liquid. but that holding is not counted among the 5 franchises in the title. When looking at the 5 logos side by side, it is very easy to conclude that this is Magic Johnson's empire: Dodgers, Sparks, LAFC, Commanders, and Spirit. That list alone is enough to turn a former athlete into one of the most recognizable sports investors in America. But here is the final paradox. Sports ownership is the most visible part, not the entire answer to how Magic became a billionaire. The stadiums, championship banners, and franchise valuations create the image of the empire. But the capital that few people see still lies in completely different places: infrastructure, technology, energy, and private investments. So if a person already owns pieces of 5 professional teams, and that is still not the entire empire, then the remaining question is, where is the wealth that the public almost never sees? And the answer lies in the assets that most sports fans almost never see. Magic Johnson did not only put money into teams with famous logos. Through JLC Infrastructure, he stepped into the world of infrastructure investing, where capital is deployed into areas such as airports, transportation, utilities, and large-scale infrastructure projects. This is a world very far from the days when Magic was still opening movie theaters or bringing Starbucks into urban neighborhoods. Investments of this type do not appear on ESPN every night. But that is precisely where institutional investors can place large amounts of capital into assets built to last for decades. And Magic did not stop at infrastructure. Through Magic Johnson Enterprises, his portfolio expanded into technology. Skydio, a company developing autonomous drones, is one example showing that Magic was ready to place capital into industries almost unrelated to basketball or celebrity branding. In energy, MJE also invested in Johnson Energy Storage, a battery and energy storage technology company. This is an investment of Magic Johnson Enterprises, not a business Magic founded solely because of the name Johnson. Financial services continued to expand through investments such as Atlanta Life Insurance Company. And behind those names is a longer list that includes Alchemy, Shot Tracker, Jopwell, Walker & Company, Mitu, Uncharted, and other venture investments that most Lakers audiences may never have associated with Magic Johnson. That is what makes the $1.6 billion figure different from a simple bank account. Magic's fortune does not sit in a safe holding $1.6 billion in cash. It is distributed across multiple layers of ownership: controlling interest in insurance, minority stakes in professional sports franchises, private companies, infrastructure vehicles, technology investments, and strategic partnerships. And when looking at that entire path, one detail from the early days suddenly becomes more important. Magic entered the NBA without truly understanding equity. Decades later, nearly every important asset in his empire was built on precisely that: ownership. Basketball gave Magic the name that America knows. The urban businesses taught him how to turn that name into commercial leverage. Healthcare created a major leap in capital. Insurance took the fortune to the billionaire tier. Sports franchises, infrastructure, and technology then turned that body of wealth into an empire far broader than what people see on the court. That is why the story of Magic Johnson is ultimately not only the story of an athlete who became rich. He spent his first career helping a franchise win. And he spent his second career learning how to own pieces of franchises, businesses, and assets that can continue to increase in value long after the final whistle of his playing career has sounded.